Good morning. I'm Father Tom Malionic, and I'm the rector of St. Paul's Church in Kinderhook, New York. And thank you for joining us this morning for our morning musings. Once again, I just didn't get it together to put up a notice up on Facebook about this, so I hope you found your way here to YouTube Live for our morning musings. And I will get something up on Facebook afterwards to alert folks that the video will be available. So I will do that, and I apologize. One of the reasons I think that this is episode 99 of our morning musings, and we are getting to the point now where I think we need to do a little bit of strategic thinking about moving forward and where we go. So tomorrow, number 100, will be our last morning musing for a while. I'm going to take a little bit of a break from that so that I can prepare some new content, certainly, and also kind of smooth out the technology a bit so that things are a little bit more predictable, less choppy. But I will make sure that that you are not left orphaned at 10 o'clock. If you've been counting on having something from us, I'll certainly send out some links to other things that will be nourishing to you, hopefully in your soul, because that's the whole reason we do this. This isn't, it's not just entertaining. It's also designed to feed us and nourish us and to help us to grow into being better disciples of Jesus Christ, to help us become better icons of the Lord in the world as we go about our daily lives, as we go about our business in the world, that people who see us, people who observe us and notice us and see not just us as individuals, but even as the church, look not only at the surface of that, but beyond, through the surface, to penetrate deeper, to look into the interior and to see through us to where they see Jesus Christ alive and well and living within us, and recognize that it is not we ourselves who live, but rather Christ who lives in and through us. And that's a very appropriate sentiment, given that today is the feast of Saint Teresa of Ávila. We'll talk a little bit more about her, but that's why we're doing this. That's why we do our morning musings, and it's why I think it's important not just simply to keep fumbling forward, but rather to take a moment and really kind of gather ourselves together. Now that I have some experience with doing this, to gather ourselves together and to really put something out there that will be a little more polished, have kind of higher production values, but also something that will be more nourishing and less padded with ums and ahs and pauses while I think about what I'm going to say next. That's the kind of thing we're doing. Anyway, today is the, among other things, the feast of Saint Teresa of Ávila, and that is a great and joyful thing. The Carmelites played a great role in my coming to faith and in my deepening faith and in my vocation to the priesthood. Just my own personal witness of this is that when I came to, I was baptized Roman Catholic, and we grew up in a conventionally Roman Catholic family. My dad was very devout, and the only book that I ever saw him reading actually was Teresa of Lisieux, another Carmelite, a later Carmelite from the early 20th century, Teresa of Lisieux, and her autobiography, Story of a Soul. And that is the only book I ever saw him read, and he just loved that book. And he was a devout man. He would get up in the morning, and he worked the early shift at the post office, and he would get up very early in the morning, and the few occasions when I would wake up early myself and tiptoe down to the kitchen as a very young boy, I would see him in the kitchen with a chair pulled out from the kitchen table, and he'd be kneeling at that chair and praying. And there was a crucifix up on the wall above the door, and he'd be praying, and he had his own little private little black book. Other guys have little black books with names and addresses of women in them. He had a little black book of prayers that he used, and so he prayed very, very steadfastly, and it was really because of his example that in my later life, of course I lost him when I was 24, and that was hard, but nevertheless, that his example and his teaching really played a great role. His faith made him a very gentle gentle person. He was cheerful. He was upbeat. He was happy. It was said of him that he would give you the shirt off his back in a blizzard, and that he could find something nice to say about an axe murderer. He was that nice a guy. So so this is partly, I think, probably for me about my dad, but nevertheless, the Carmelites. To go back to the Carmelites, maybe I should tell you a little bit about the Carmelites in case you are unaware. This is kind of Catholic. Maybe you could think of this as Roman Catholic trivia, but again, the spiritual legacy of people like Teresa of Ávila, Teresa of Lisieux, of John of the Cross, of Simon Stock, on Christianity as it developed even through and past the time of the Reformation, is significant. It is it's profound. They had a great effect, not only in and of themselves, but as parts of wider movements within the church. So maybe I should start like from the very beginning and tell you that once upon a time, in Christianity, after Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire, the state religion, and became widespread, and it was not only acceptable to be a Christian now, it was not only decriminalized, it was actually a point in your favor. It was a positive thing to have happen. The church was growing, continued to grow by leaps and bounds as word of the good news spread outward from the Mediterranean basin outward into Europe, to the north, the west, and the northeast. Excuse me, and up even into the British Isles. Excuse me. It became a and the way, of course, it spread is that you would convert the sovereign or the monarch in the local region where you were, and then all the rest of the people would be baptized with them, and even though they were technically baptized and technically Christian, and there were now Christian churches to go to worship, there was still a long process of learning, of catechesis, of developing a Christian culture, so that Christianity was not competing with local pagan beliefs or pagan religions. So we have that spread of Christianity that way. But in the midst of all of that, as Christianity became conventional, and especially as it became a means of advancement in the world, it was a plus to be a Christian, and there were folks that were recognizing that this was maybe not the unmitigated good development it could have been, because what it did was it allowed people to go along thinking of themselves as good and completed Christians, when in fact there was a whole lot of unaddressed stuff in their souls. And so a few folks decided that they needed to go and wrestle with those forces that remained within us, those forces of sin, the tendency to sin. And they withdrew to deserted places, to the deserts of Egypt, where they simply practiced a very simple life, and a life of prayer, mostly by memorizing the Psalms and simply reciting them day in and day out together, even as they worked. And they would do work that would not require too much mental attentiveness. They'd weave baskets or whatever. And the whole point of that was to enable them to grapple with those forces, those demons within, whether it be greed, or whether it be lust, or whether it be envy or pride or anger. Whatever it is you were bringing with you, it accompanied you. It was not something that the world imposed on you. It's not like the world made you be this way, or as Flip Wilson used to say, the devil made me do it. It's not like that. Those are manifestations of the sin that we all carry within us, and we need to expose those areas to the loving transformation of God. And part of that does involve living in community. It involves being vulnerable in community. It means exposing ourselves and our shortcomings to one another in community. And at the same time bestowing grace on one another in community and mercy on one another in community. But that willingness to admit and to repent, and then that reciprocal action of tolerance, forbearance, not tolerance even, because we don't do this through gritted teeth, but we actually do rejoice at the sinner who repents, at the one who says, yes, I know I have these problems and I need to change and I need to repent. And the community helps in that, precisely by continuing to love and to support that person as they deal with whatever it is they're dealing with. Those are all things that happen in community. So these desert monks, or desert nuns, if you will, and there were quite a few women among them, they would withdraw to the desert. They would reduce to an absolute minimum all of the external distractions of living in the world. So they would be as unconcerned as possible with a standard of living or a way of life. They lived in very sparse conditions, precisely so they would not be taken up with worrying about decorating their cell, or they might do that to a certain extent because beauty is part of this, but it's not an obsession with those things. It's not making those things into a value. How much we have to eat. You have enough. That's it. That's all you need. It's just enough. It doesn't have to be necessarily tasty food, although you would have that for guests because you wanted to be hospitable. That was a good thing. There's lots of stories about them. They're a number of them translated and collected by Benedicta Ward, Sister Benedicta Ward of the Sisters of the Love of God in England. I'm not sure if she's still with us or not, but she did a number of volumes on the lives of the Desert Fathers, the sayings of the Desert Fathers. Quite an interesting bunch, and lots of wisdom that they would impart to their disciples and to visitors and so on. They were considered holy people. But they went out into the desert to escape not the world because the world was evil, but to escape the distractions of the world that kept them from dealing with their own evil. And that's a big difference. I think one that we kind of lose today. We've fallen into this this sort of illusion that has actually, it's plagued Christianity all along, that there's really, matter is bad. This is the Gnostic temptation, that matter is bad, that created reality is bad. It's going away anyway, so why pay too much attention to it? But the idea is that this is all God's creation, and God is bringing it to its fulfillment and it's passing only in the sense that it's passing in its current corrupt and compromised form, but it is going to be brought to its perfection, and it will not just simply be disembodied reality. It won't just simply be a spiritual thing. There is a very real and concrete dimension to creation that is not going to go away. It will be replaced with a better version of itself, but that's what God is working out in the world. So so these folks went out into the desert, and that tradition of withdrawing to the desert, living a life of contemplation, a life of prayer, a life of studying the scriptures, a life of conversing with God, a life of subjecting oneself to hardship in order to expose, to tease out and expose the areas in which we are compromised, so that we know as we fast, for example, the point at which we start to get hungry, and notice the things that we are hungry for, and how important are those things in our lives, and can we live without them, and can we do without them? We may not have to in the long run. They may not be an obstacle to our relationship with God, but they might be, and we need to examine that, and we need to test that, and we need to really be sure that when push really does come to shove, we do not choose those things over our relationship with God. It's the priorities that matter. So people would, traditions grew up. There were communities that grew up, even though the monks may have lived in solitude, or at most with maybe an apprentice, a novice, if you will, someone who wanted to learn how to live this life. they might live with one or two novices, but basically living alone. And yet they would come together. They would come together for the celebration of the Eucharist. They would come together for to learn, to teach one another, to share their wisdom, and to hold one another accountable. We still have communities like that, say on Mount Athos in Greece, the holy mountain. Lots of different communities of monks that have sprung up and that have made their life there. Well, there were communities like this in the Holy Land as well. One of them was on Mount Carmel, and it was that Mount Carmel is this peninsula that juts out into the Mediterranean, and it is renowned in Scripture as the place where Elijah confronted the prophets of Baal. And these monks gathered on Mount Carmel. There was a spring. They built themselves a well. It's the fountain of Elijah there, and there they commemorated what Elijah had done. And they thought of themselves as spiritual successors of Elijah. And they also thought of themselves as spiritual successors of the Virgin Mary. Elijah, in his zeal for God, there's that wonderful line from the Psalm, "Zeal for your house has consumed me." And Elijah says that. He says, I am consumed with zeal for the house of the Lord. And they were zealous for that. And they also venerated the Virgin Mary and took her as their model, because she was the one who said, yes, when God proposed something absolutely outrageous to her, she was the one who said yes. When God asked for essentially control over her, she said yes. She was the one who gave into God's plan and who aligned herself with it voluntarily. She could have said no, but she said yes. And so she goes along with God's plan. And they wanted to be like that, as ready as Mary to throw themselves into whatever God was wanting to accomplish through them. So we have these hermits living on Mount Carmel. Now there's hermits, being a hermit, living pretty much alone, dealing with your own stuff. That's one form of living of this kind of monastic life. There are distinctions among different kinds of what we call religious life, and religious there doesn't mean devoted to religious-y things, churchy things. Religion means bound to a rule that you follow along with others. You follow a rule of life. That is your religion in the strict technical sense, the way the word was used really for the first 1,500 years of Christianity. Religion meant not just whatever belief system you happened to have. It's not that we have say the religion of Buddhism as a religion, or Taoism as a religion, or whatever. We use those terms today, but basically the idea of religion is that this is what you are bound to. Religio comes from the verb to bind. This is what you are bound to. It is a rule of life. It is a way of living, like Saint Benedict's rule, right? That gives you a religious life. So religious life is life lived, and it's contrasted to life lived in the world, where you're a Christian, you go to church on Sunday, whatever, but you essentially run your own life kind of as you see fit during the week. But a religious life is a life that is bound to some outside agreed upon structure. So your way of doing things, your times of prayer, your times of fasting, your times of feasting, all of these things are subject to, when you go to bed, when you get up in the morning. Those things are all regulated. They are part of the regula, the rule of life. And there were different rules. We have in the West, the rule of Saint Benedict became one of the most prominent ones, and a lot of monastic houses. Monastic comes, the word monk comes from the Greek word meaning alone. So originally monks were loners, hermits, if you will. And eventually they came to found houses and to live in larger communities. That's called cenobitic, from the same meaning in community, living in community. but they still lived according to a rule, a religio. Eventually there got to be so many of these. We had the rule of Saint Benedict, and there was the rule. Carmel had its own rule. Rules would be approved eventually. They would be approved by the church authorities increasingly in Rome or your local patriarch in the East, and they would be established and they would be approved. So you would have the rule of Benedict, which was largely the Western monastic rule. You had the rule of St. Basil, which is the monastic rule in the East. But then as civilization grew and developed in Europe, and you started to have the rise of cities, you started to have the development of urbanism, and you had then people who might have been originally drawn to a monastic life, and you could live a monastic life, certainly when everything was agricultural and rural. You could fend for yourself. You could grow things. You could have gardens. You could have farms. You could have dairy operations and chickens and whatever else you need. You could go fishing. You could be self-sustaining in that way. But in a city, it was harder to do, and it was certainly harder to get away from the distractions of ordinary everyday life. If you tried to shut yourself up in a house or a building and try to live that contemplative life in that kind of an environment, it would be pretty hard to make a living. So how would you do this without commerce, without interaction? So we started to have the development in the West, certainly, of what began to be called the mendicant orders. They were the begging orders. So they did not make their living by industry, at least not by any particularly profitable industry, but rather they would go out and they would beg and they would ask for support from passersby. They would stand on the corner and beg. They were also not, unlike the monasteries, where when you joined a monastery, as they developed, you would join that monastery and your allegiance would be to that monastery. You'd take a vow not only of poverty, so that you would own no property of your own, or not of chastity, so that you would renounce pleasures of the flesh of every kind. Chastity doesn't just extend to sexuality, but it certainly, that's a major part of it. And obedience, which means that you would be governed by the rule and by an abbot. For example, a father of the house would be elected to supervise the running of the house and to make sure that that the rule of the order was observed. So you take vow of poverty, chastity, and obedience. But in a monastery, you take a vow also of stability, which means that you would not go wandering around. And there was a big problem with monks who would just go in and they would kind of, live that life for a while, and then they'd decide they were bored with it, or they'd get into the bad relationships would develop with some other monk or some other groups of monks, and then they would pick up and they would just go to another monastery, and that was a huge problem. This vagrant monks, they were called. They were vagrants. They would go vagrant means wanderer. They would wander from one place to another, and so they wouldn't sit still, and they wouldn't sit still long enough to work through whatever it was, the disagreements, the insults, the hurts, the slights, and so on. One of the major lessons of the monastery is that we stay put in community even when it becomes tough to be community. And that's a lesson that I think our church in our day and age needs to learn. We have a lot of religious vagrants, people who decide, well, somebody looked at me the wrong way. I'm not going to come back here anymore. I'm going to go somewhere else. I don't like this, or I don't like that. I'm just going to pick up and go someplace else, or maybe not go anywhere. I'll just go home. That instability is not just personal instability. It contributes to instability in the entire institution, in the entire body of Christ. That the entire body of Christ does have an order to it, an orderliness to it. So what happened was you had the development of these mendicant orders, and there came to be a number of them, and a number of rules that began to be accepted by new groups that would form, and they would adopt an existing rule, or they might write their own. There was such a proliferation of these rules that in 1215, the Fourth Council of the Lateran said that there would henceforth be no new religion, which didn't mean, that nobody else could believe in any other kind of God. It meant that there would be no new rules. If you wanted to found a religious community, you'd have to adopt an existing kind of rule. Well, the Carmelites had one rule. The Benedictines have another rule, and their rule later developed, and there were versions of the Benedictine life, like the Trappists. They had a stricter rule. They were called the Order of Cistercians of the Strict Observance, and they would follow a modified version of the rule of Benedict, but they're still in the Benedictine tradition. The Carthusians, Saint Bruno founded a monastery in the Pyrenees, I believe, in France, and or in the mountains of France, wherever it is, maybe the Alps. Anyway, he founds a monastery in the mountains of France. There's a Carthusian hermitage monastery in Vermont, southern Vermont, on Mount Equinox, not far from here. There is Saint Bruno has his own rule for his monks, and there were various others. People like Saint Francis or Saint Dominic come along and try to build a version of Christian living that would address the issues of their day. Saint Francis, reforming and rebuilding the church that had fallen into a certain kind of decadence. People went because, it was nice sometimes to go to church, and it was pleasant, and they would go on Christmas, or they'd go on Easter when there was something entertaining going on. But rather than really throw themselves into the work of becoming Christian and the work of learning what it means to follow Christ and so on, they just kind of went about their business. There was a decline in general moral standards as people became, again, more concerned for themselves. You had the wars, even wars of religion. After the Reformation, we had battles over which religion was going to prevail, or which version of Christianity was going to prevail in a given area. The Fourth Lateran Council said, no more new religious orders, no more new religious rules. If you want to start a religious community, pick one that's already there. But the big ones in the Middle Ages, the mendicant orders, were the Franciscans, the Dominicans, the Augustinians, and these monks that had once been on Mount Carmel in the Holy Land when the Crusades were going on. They kind of migrated. There may be Carmelite hermits left, I guess, on Mount Carmel and the peninsula in Israel today, but regardless, a lot of them went to Europe and decided to modify their lifestyle so that they were not just simply hermits living and praying and living a contemplative life, but that they lived a more active life. They at least had some pastoral ministry. There's a distinction between contemplative life and the active or the apostolic life. Both can be governed by a rule, but the contemplative life is, again, it's focused around the praise and worship of God, and it's focused around the development of personal transformations, so that the people who populate that monastery might share their wisdom with others. The Carthusians do not. The Carthusians don't write, publish. They don't do spiritual direction. They don't see visitors. They don't do hospitality. They're there solely to praise and worship God, and to be, as best they can, disciples of Jesus Christ. But then there are others who feel called to go out into the world and to do pastoral work or apostolic work according to a rule, unlike the parish clergy, who are governed only by what their local bishop would command them to do, or allow them to do, or assign them to do. So you have religious priests, and you have secular priests. Secular priests are like people like me. We work in a parish. We earn our living through the pastoral work that we do. We are subject to the local bishop. The religious communities are subject to their own superiors. There's coordination, but their line of authority goes through their own superiors in their community, and they follow the rule of their community. That might sometimes include going out to work and to staff a parish. but it may include other kinds of work as well. The Carmelites, the Franciscans certainly had their charism. Their idea was to go out and to just be joyful beggars for the Lord and to just tell people about the Lord whenever they could. And they developed a way of doing that was accessible and simple. It was, they came up with a lot of our kind of customs, like the Christmas creche, the idea of a nativity scene. That's a Franciscan invention. The idea was, again, to popularize among ordinary people the story of Jesus Christ. The Dominicans focused themselves on preaching. That's their name, the Order of Preachers. St. Dominic founded what he called the Order of Preachers. The OP is their abbreviation. And they, Ordo Predicatorum, they go out and they preach and they study and they learn and address the philosophical errors that lead people away from Christ. So you have the Augustinians, many of whom worked as staff in cathedrals, and so on. And there are various different developments out of all of these. Well, the Carmelites go to Europe, and they become more like one of these mendicant orders, except they preserve a contemplative bias in their way of living this religious life. And they establish houses and so on. Well, time goes on, and you get to the 1400s, 1500s. You have the 1400s in Spain when there's quite a bit of religious conflict. You have Catholics, you have Jews, and you have Muslims all living kind of side by side in Spain. And Ferdinand and Isabella come to the throne, and the decision is made to Catholicize Spain, and that means the Jews leave. With Columbus, 1492. Columbus sailed the ocean blue with boatloads of Jews. And the idea was that it would give them an escape. There were some Jews who converted and became Christian, but preserved at home some of the Jewish lore, Jewish teaching, Jewish doctrine, Jewish men. Maybe, and some of it was perhaps superficial compliance, and some of it was sincere. Teresa, a woman named Teresa Almeida de Cepeda, I believe her name was. She comes from one of those families, conversos. But she does, actually, I think, she has grown up a real Christian. She's not just pretending, but she does have some of that Judaism in her background. And she decides that she's going to become a nun. She's going to enter the convent in her native town of Ávila, or city of Ávila. I believe it's a fairly large city. So she goes and she joins, and she adopts. She lives according to the Carmelite rule there. But life in the convent in those days was not what we think of as the sort of austere kind of living that we think of today with monks and nuns. These were society ladies. They brought their servants with them, their maidservants with them to the convent. They were waited on, and they had their food cooked for them, to order, and they would go out to parties and so on. It's just that they lived in this community. Teresa, and she lived that life for a long time, and was prayerful, sort of, not particularly zealous, not particularly distinctive for her holiness or for her devotion or for anything like that. She was kind of an ordinary local young woman who was learning to live this religious life. But then around the age of 40, she starts to be kind of zapped, I think, by God. She has these mystical experiences that people have tried to explain away as migraines or some sort of epilepsy or mental illness of some kind or another. But she has these religious experiences, and she certainly attributes them to religious experiences. She has, as do all monks and nuns, a spiritual director, someone that she talks about her spiritual life, her prayer life too. Someone who can hold her accountable and help her navigate the sometimes fairly blurry and sometimes fairly treacherous line between the true influence of God and the influences of your own spirit or the influences of the evil one. So she has Jesuits who are quite learned about such things, having learned from Ignatius how to help people discern what is true and right in religious life, in their spiritual lives. And so they eventually she is led to think that she would like to found a religious house that would be more strictly religious, that would be purely contemplative for her nuns. And she goes and she does this. She gets permission to do it. It is not an easy thing. This is the era, remember, in which the Spanish Inquisition is also active. And so, and the Reformation is starting to happen in in Germany and starting to take root in other places as well. And so there's quite a bit of turmoil in the church. And so any suggestions of novelty, particularly by a woman in that day and age, were suspect. And she had to overcome a lot of suspicion, and she had to overcome a lot of opposition. Which she does. She's a pretty charismatic individual. She's witty. She's funny. She's, from all accounts, somewhat attractive. I got a picture of her here that I can show you. There's Teresa. She writes books of advice for her nuns. She writes about the progress of the spiritual life. She writes her autobiography. She has a wonderful way of sort of giving people that spiritual advice and living a life that is truly joyful, but not joyful because she gets to go and kind of do what she wants. It's joyful within the confines of the rule. She finds her joy in that life of prayer and contemplation. There's a wonderful statue which I didn't get a picture of her in a moment of one of these raptures where it's as if God had shot an arrow of love into her, and it's a very moving piece of art. She goes out and she founds these convents of nuns throughout Spain. She gets a Franciscan friar, Saint John of the Cross, and Saint John becomes her agent or collaborator in reforming the men's side of the Carmelite movement, and sets up and he gets actually thrown in prison by his fellow Carmelites for trying to change their way of life, for trying to make their way of life less worldly, less socially oriented, less comfortable. And he wants something that people are really committed to, this life of getting to know God and really stripping away all that is holding us back, all of the distractions that we cling to because they've become so important to us or so precious to us or so pleasant, or because we feel so safe in them. And instead, they want growth in the spiritual life. They want to get deeper and deeper and deeper into God, and again become better and better instruments in God's hands, better, of more use to God. So that's what they're up to. That's what they're doing. So Teresa does this, and the Carmelite reforms, and there still are the older Carmelites also reform themselves, not in the way that Teresa and John did. Teresa and John founded what came to be known as the Order of Discalced Carmelites, meaning they went without shoes. They would wear sandals at best, but it was part of their simplicity and part of their renunciation of comfort and wealth that led them to be discalced, so that they would wear sandals and not shoes. There was the Carmelites who came to call themselves the Carmelites of the strict observance. The discalced Carmelites, you will notice, they have OCD after their name. Does not mean obsessive compulsive. It means Order of Discalced Carmelites, OCD, because the order of adjectives and nouns is reversed in Latin. And then there is the O Carms, the Order of Carmelites, the ancient observance. and they have taken up a role largely in the present day. They take the ministry with which their order is most closely associated is education. So they run schools and so on. The Discalced Carmelites tend to preserve that contemplative life. They do some scholarly work. They might have some parishes and use some of the income that they're able to get from the parishes to help support the order. They run retreat centers. They give lectures and talks, missions, parish missions, and so on. All of this leading up to my story here. So we have the Discalced Carmelites, and preserving that, particularly around the time of Vatican II, when all of the religious orders were taking a second look at their life and seeing perhaps how they may have gone astray, how they may have lost touch with the specific gifts, the specific charism, the specific vocation and call that characterized their order. During a time when that was happening, there was some movement in the Carmelite orders, and particularly in the Discalced Carmelites, to recover and reestablish this idea of the hermit life, of the contemplative life. Women's orders, women's Carmelite convents are almost entirely, if they're of the Discalced, they're strictly cloistered. The nuns do not go out. They're not out in public. They don't socialize. They might have an outside job, perhaps as a teacher or something like that, or they might do some other work, but not something that still allows them to preserve that primary contemplative vocation that they have. The men's order tends to go out and take up other work, again, as far as they need to in order to support themselves and their order, their brothers and sisters in the order. So there was a Discalced Carmelite named William McNamara who had this idea of founding a hermitage that would draw new young people into this sort of Carmelite way of life. And I forget where the original one was. They eventually moved to Nova Scotia at one point, and I think ultimately they wound up in Colorado. And unfortunately, McNamara himself, the founder, I believe was implicated in some all too familiar patterns of I don't know. He was accused by several women of being inappropriate with them, and I don't know the details, so I don't know the extent of it or what it is. But in the end, he left. But he had written a book at one point called The Human Adventure, and it was the first book that really made sense to me of how one could really be a vibrant Christian, how one could really find tremendous joy and satisfaction in the religious life, and at the same time not just simply play act at being pious. So that there was a real he had a way of drawing me, at least as I read this book. He had a way of drawing me into a life that was really fully grounded in actual reality and material reality, and yet at the same time shot through with God. And it just grabbed me. And that whole vision, if you will, stayed with me for many years through grad school. And when finally I graduated from graduate school, I worked for a year and finally decided that I really need to give these Carmelites a try. So I just sort of sight unseen, unannounced, walked up to the door of the Carmelite Monastery on Harewood Road in Washington, D.C., and knocked on the door. And Brother Brian answered the door, and I said, "Hi there, I think I want to be a Carmelite priest." And of course, this is not the kind of thing you expect. So he said, "Okay, why don't you have a seat over here? We'll see if we can get someone to talk to you." And so they did. And I made preparations to become a Discalced Carmelite friar. It wasn't long after that my father died, and things changed for me quite radically at that point. Also, the Carmelites are not a well-heeled order, and they're not healed at all. They're discalced, but they're not well off, and so they were not like some of the other orders in a position, for example, to pay off my student loans. So I had to go out and get a job. Got a job, got to know other people, became involved in another Christian community, another Catholic Christian community, charismatic community in Washington. Through that, met Judith, and here I am. That's the short story. But it was the Carmelites that drew me in, and it was the Carmelites that really gave me this sense that it is possible to live a really vibrant contemplative life and yet still exist in the world. So Teresa is very important to me, and that's maybe more of a personal testimony than anything. But I hope it's given you some idea, particularly those of you who don't come out of a Roman Catholic background, about all the various forces that were in play and that led down to where we are today. Still have good friends. I still saw Brother Brian until I left Washington, and they continue to occupy a very special and warm place in my heart. I was going to talk a little bit about Jonah, but I can see we're getting close to time here. I have just a couple of things. Teresa left, in addition to her prose writing, she left some poetry as well. And there goes the recycling truck. Anyway, she left behind some poetry, and you may have heard this one, and you may not have known where it came from. Christ has no body now but yours, no hands, no feet on earth but yours. Yours are the eyes through which he looks with compassion on this world. Again, that very, very strong incarnational spirituality there. But then she had another poem that you may also have heard as a prayer, Let Nothing Disturb You, Nada te turbe. Let nothing disturb you, let nothing frighten you. All things pass away, God never changes. Patience obtains all things. He who has God finds that he lacks nothing. God alone suffices. Beautiful prayer. There is a Taizé version of that, which I had wanted to play, and then I realized that if I did that, it would probably violate some copyright thing, and YouTube might not let this video go up. So I decided against that. However, I am going to, as we exit today, let you listen to the what is kind of the Carmelite hymn, Flos Carmeli. It's the Flower of Carmel, and it is a song to Our Lady of Mount Carmel, and that is Flower of Carmel, fruitful vine, splendor of heaven, unique childbearing virgin, kind mother, and mother even though you did not know man. Be merciful to the Carmelites. O star of the sea. So I'll play that for you as we leave, and remind you that we'll be back on Facebook at 5 o'clock this afternoon for evening prayer, and that we will be back tomorrow morning for our last morning musings, that I'm available to talk with you or to help you in your spiritual life in any way that I can. Just be in touch, and whatever that is, I will share with you whatever God shares with me to share with you. And all of it free of charge. What we have freely received, we freely give. So I will leave you with that and ask for your prayers, your continued and ongoing prayers for me and for St. Paul's Church, and assure you that you have my prayers until we meet again.
Los Carmeli, vitis florigera, splendor celi, virgo purvera, secularis, maternitis, sed privilegia, stella Amen.